Okay, so today we will share with you the 4 pillars for achieving impact in your recommendations or other improvement action. Now, you've had an opportunity to have access to the 4 pillars, but if you let us know either in the chat box or in the email sequence and follow up after the webinar, we will make sure that you receive it. Okay, so to set the scene, the techniques we will share apply to all types of review. And that means it could be a children's review, a safeguarding adults review, or a domestic homicide review. Now, not everybody is used to learning with this commonality across 3 types of review. And I want to assure you that recommendations are used in all of the types of review, as you well know, although the expectations around approach and number do differ. I have to stress here that those differences are very much around local areas just as much as they are around a culture in one type of review. So it's legitimate and I think helpful to learn with colleagues across 3 types of review here. And the commonality here is that every partnership that we have worked with across 200 reviews all appreciate a review which takes a logical and proportionate approach to recommendations. That is across the board. Okay, so may I invite you to turn off your distractions. And this is because, so as I say that, my cat just came very noisily through the cat flap, which was very timely indeed. I want to remind you that I need your focus here. It's a short amount of time that I'm asking for that. And it's because I want you to get the most from today. I want you to leave feeling that our time was well spent. And I want to be able to empower you to do some of these challenging things that we're going to suggest in your review. So what does it mean? It means, please, would you switch off your phone, close down your browsers, and please continue to interact with us. This is part of what makes this work, and it's part of what will improve what we can give to you. So post your questions in there. We've reserved plenty of Q&A time, and we will respond after Marian's presentation. So it's going to look like it's just collecting up, but we're going to make sure that we got it all together for you for the Q&A. Okay. What does success look like? We're starting with the ending so that you can see how it all unfolds. Hopefully you will leave feeling that you know more about what stakeholder buy-in will look like. You'll be able to think more about being focused and intuitive rather than thinking about smartness. You'll be able to understand when you need some measures to maintain momentum. And you'll be able to use your process more to create change versus that leaning in on your recommendations a little bit too heavily, which is what many of us have tended to do. Okay, I'm going to move straight over to you and ask you to engage with us in the chat box. Where are you at in your recommendation practice? So can we have a 1 if you're comfortable and you're really quite experienced with leaving behind smartness and working in new ways? 2, you already favour using the process as much as you can to having large numbers of recommendations at the end. Can you give us a 3 if you're sceptical about improvement actions remaining a priority once you set your improvement actions, but you're a little bit sceptical? Gretchen, I'll come back to smartness if you like. And a 4 if you're just inexperienced and you want to know more about, for instance, securing buy-in. So you could type a 1, a 2, and you can do a combination of something that really resonates with you. Janice, you're a 4, you want to hear more. Karen, you definitely favour using the process. Victoria's a 4, Susie's a 4. Okay, we've got Viv, who's a 4. Chris is definitely wanting to favour using the process. We've got more 2s. Nikki Brown John wants to use the process more. Nikki Pettit is really comfortable with leaving behind smartness and is in favour of using the process more. We've got Jane, who's sceptical about whether her improvement actions would remain a priority after things shift and things move with later reviews, perhaps. Helen Bannister is also sceptical. She's thinking through about her improvement actions and them remaining a priority. Kath wants to use the process more instead of waiting for recommendations at the end. Can I remind everybody that SMART recommendations are an approach that has been used and is still favoured by many organisations who will urge us when it comes to quality assurance to get really smart. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound. And I'm going to share with you after the class a toolkit for kind of SMART and other types of recommendations. So that will expand on what we say today a lot more. Sarah, you're comfortable and you were willing to leave behind smartness. And Amanda wants to communicate that she wants to hear more about securing buying. Sue, you're a 3 and a 4. So that means you're sceptical about whether it remains a priority and you want to learn more about securing buying. So you're a multi-agency training coordinator. Okay. Disseminating information about today's webinar to the board, which is super helpful. Thank you. Priya, you're a 4. So we will talk a lot more about securing buying. Thank you for all of that. Okay, so introducing the 4 pillars, which I hope you've had a chance to look at. We can send them to you if you haven't. The first 3 pillars are going to be dealt with by Marian in her presentation. And they are about improving knowledge rather than documentation, about encouraging repeated audits and scrutiny. So I think that will feed into your point about how does this remain a priority for the partnership. Talking about awareness raising, perhaps as an alternative to training, or an addition, Marian might say. And I will talk about pillar 4, which is achieving sign-up by syncing with the action plan. Okay, I've got a couple of slides to just introduce Marian and her survey by just recapping on history. And this really does involve going kind of 6 or 7 years back. These messages about recommendations are far from new, and this is why it makes it super interesting for me to hear from Marian today, who will bring us far more up to date than this. If you look back at this, the barriers to learning from 2014, we were being told back then that there was a need for fewer but more meaningful recommendations and actions. And then this really kind of specific and practice-based piece of advice came out. If you've got recurring themes from one board, can you please cross-refer to another review rather than keep repeating them to focus for each and every review. I remember back in this time, this 2014 time, and I'll give you the second layer that was hitting us. I remember being with the SILT reviewers when this landed. The national panel produced their first annual report, and they were using language like, you know, the quality of the overview reports is disturbingly variable. And, you know, we took this to heart, and we wanted to run with it, because recommendations were part of the picture of what was considered to be disturbingly variable. Now, I'll come to the slide now about how SILT and how our organisation reacted to all of this. And you may stay with me for this, or you may think I'm really skeptical about what you're going to say, Donna. So as a team, we decided to set ourselves the challenge that if you could count your recommendations on the fingers of one hand, this was something to aim for. So we'd say no more than a handful of recommendations, and that we were going to pick the biggest lessons. The nub of the case was what we called it. And I know, because I find it challenging, and we all find it challenging to get to that nub. So please don't feel that we are superhuman. We all have more than we want to end up with, and we have to find what the nub of the case is. And hopefully today and some of what I can follow up with will help you to do that. We've got a toolkit, and it's kind of, there's quite a few tricks for you in there. Okay, so back to over to you. You've heard probably what's going to make you most uncomfortable. I don't know what Marian's going to say, but I know that this makes it feel really uncomfortable for some people. Can you tell us if you're a 1 and it makes you feel uncomfortable, and that you've got the potential for missing some valuable learning if you try to go for that number of recommendations? A 2, if you think, well, I'm really skeptical about the need to go to be that proportionate about my recommendations. A 3, if you're thinking, do you know what, this is the challenge and I can begin working to it now. And a 4, if you're just listening for now and don't have the experience to say either way. Karen, uncomfortable, thank you. Nicola, you think about the challenge. Susie, you're listening. Chris is up for the challenge, and Nikki Pettit, I know for sure, is up for the challenge. Helen, Sadie, pretty. Karen Reese, fantastic. You would be interested in this kind of challenge. Jenny is listening. Siobhan is interested in this challenge, as is Wendy. Fantastic to hear that, Wendy. Pauline and Karen Perry would be interested in this kind of challenge, to bring it down to the recommendations that fit the fingers of one hand. And this isn't easy stuff, and I hear you and acknowledge that. Kath Connor, you will have a go at this number of recommendations, as would Penny. So thank you very much for that. Tim, you would too, as would Selena, consider this challenge. This is far more positive in favour of having a go at this approach, which is really super encouraging. Thank you. And it's good background for Marian to begin telling us about what she has learned from her survey. Marian, may I hand over to you?
Of course. Thank you very much indeed, Donna. So I've been doing work for a long time on serious case abuse, and I've recognised lots of you in the audience. And I think I'm going to be talking today about the triennial analysis, which I think is the 6th or 7th set of reviews that I've done for England. And most of those have been done alongside Professor Peter Sidebotham and his team at Warwick University. So big team at the University of East Anglia, big team at Warwick University. And one of the frustrations about doing the work on serious case reviews and the national analysis is that it's always retrospective, it's always after the event. And it's particularly frustrating that the review that we did of cases from 2014 to 17, which was ready in 2019, wasn't published until 2020. So Donna says it's really bang up to date, but let's be honest, it's about cases from 2014 to 17. It's been sitting around for a while, and we've got a new system of doing reviews, and we've got a new context of COVID and a new sets of challenges. So I'll kind of try and keep that in mind when I'm talking. I'm not going to be talking for very long, about 20 minutes, because we do want lots of times for discussion. So recommendations. What I'm going to be talking about and thinking about alongside Donna's notion of pillars is really, are recommendations a good way to get impact? Are they the best way? Are there other ways of doing it? So it's not just about recommendations, but it's how recommendations fit. So Donna, if you can move to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you very much. So when we were commissioned to do the training review, after we put in the bid to do that, the Department for Education were very keen that we did a special study on recommendations. That was part of the brief. And they wanted us to assess the extent to which recommendations made in these reviews have been implemented and the consequent impact on child protection practice. So not just recommendations, but how they fit and what their impact is. Now, this is the third time that we've done a specific study on recommendations. So we did them in 2009 and 10, and again in the training review for but that was published in 2016. So we thought we'd actually tackle it in a bit of a new way, because we haven't before had access to the views of people working in local safeguarding boards, as was at the time, around the country. So if we move on to the next slide, Donna. We did it by actually setting out a survey. Now, surveys are notoriously tricky to get good information from. Any of you who've tried to construct a survey will realise how hard it is to make them short, how hard it is to make the answers meaningful. And we were very aware that the answers were going to be pretty tight and brief, because the survey, you can't write reams in that. So we wanted to follow them up with some interviews, and we had a fantastic response, both to the survey and to people wanting to do phone interviews. So we're really delighted that the response to the survey was 66%. So that is, I mean, you might not think that's very good, 2/3, but a lot of surveys only get about a 25% response rate. So I think it's really indicative of the enthusiasm and the interest of local safeguarding boards, that they wanted to contribute to this work and want to make our recommendations work and want to make serious case reviews have an impact. Slight mistake there. We didn't get we had feedback from 101 surveys, but we only got 91 back, but it's still a 66% response rate. And the discussions with our interviewees were fantastic. And we had interviews with people who were local safeguarding board chairs, but a lot of business managers and some senior managers. So people with a lot of expertise who could help fill in the gaps from the survey. So we also compared what we found with what we got out of the triennial from 2011 to 14, which came out in 2016. And then when we had some findings, we wanted to check out whether what we'd discovered made sense to people. And we had two really interesting workshops, one in Birmingham and one in London, where experienced practitioners and leaders gave their views about what we were finding and added extra information that helped us construct the report. So thank you, Donna. Next slide, please. So where do these recommendations fit? And are there recommendations? So it depends a bit on how you're doing the serious case review, how recommendations work. And some particular types of review don't have recommendations at all. They have learning points. And that's particularly true of the Sky Learning Together model. So you can see down the side on the left-hand side all the different types of review that we found. And what was interesting is the three categories at the bottom make up the largest group. So just under 43% of the reviews that we looked at didn't have a particular model that was specified. So that was interesting. So recommendations fit differently in the different types of model. And when we looked at this work initially, when we did our first study of recommendations back in 2009 and 10, we found that there are an average of 47 recommendations, and we made the lots of I suppose learning points there about that's really much too many. How on earth can you hope to implement 47 recommendations? So then when we looked again in 2011 and 14, we were really pleased that the number of recommendations had dropped. So at that time, there were 7 recommendations, although they did range. So if you've got an average, there's going to be a lot either side of more or less. And the number of recommendations ranged from none at all to 53. So what we had most recently was 7 recommendations again. So not far off, Donna, your kind of call for 5. So mostly people have really got the message that you mustn't have too many of them. Still, the range of number of recommendations was from 0 to 39, so lots of scope for whittling them down. But I think people have started to get the message that you really can't achieve very much with an inordinate number of recommendations. So Donna, next slide, please. So what was made very clear to us in the survey, in the interviews, and very powerfully in the workshops that we had as well, it isn't just about the number of recommendations, but the number of serious case reviews that people are doing. So some areas said that they were just completely overwhelmed with one serious case review after another and after another, and the recommendations banked up. But also numerous recommendations meant that they really had recommendation overload. And because they had too many to work on and to try and do something about, they lost their impact. And there was a kind of general sense of serious case review fatigue in lots of areas. So fatigue in kind of getting through the process, getting through recommendations. And really by the time you got to that point, people feel that their energy is dissipated, and how can you kind of then pull yourself up and start to make a difference with what you found from that particular review. So what I want to think about for a little bit now is just to have a bit of thought about what kind of impact, what kind of recommendations actually do make an impact. So this was a series of questions in the survey. So if we move on, Donna, I can start to have a think about that. So recommendations that make an impact. So on the one hand, there were comments saying that recommendations that are specific rather than vague are easy to implement. But on the other hand, there were views that recommendations need to be systemic, and the people wanting more systemic recommendations, they tended not to be as tight and specific. So the specific ones said a more specific recommendation is much more likely to result in worker agency systemic change, or someone saying as long as the recommendations are smart and contextual, they can have a huge impact in practice, and Don was already explained about smart. Whereas on the systemic side, systemic recommendations are helpful as there may not be a solution, but they require more thought and wider discussion. So it's not necessarily about putting specifics right, but it's about having a broader thought about how the system works and is operating. And on the right-hand side, still too much reliance on wanting to train issues away rather than address systemic issues that are harder to address. And another one saying recommendations in connection with all levels of influence is key when it happens. So you need to make sure that you're targeting not just frontline practitioners, but all levels of organizations and across organizations. There were also some views that said that, no, back again, Donna. Back to the previous slide, please. Particularly from the workshops that we had, there was a sense that the serious case review works if it's close to home and if it's real. So people need to feel connected with the review. They need to feel they own it and it's part of them. So that makes the difference in how that's translated into impact. So next one now, sorry about that. Okay. So we asked what kind of recommendations had a substantial impact. And it was interesting because there were lots of people saying that the ones with the most impact, or half of the people who returned the survey said it's about training. So that's interesting, isn't it? When I just said that reliance on training issues away, but recommendations relating to procedural protocol development, 40%. Awareness raising 37% and audits 37%. So these were the most substantial impact was thought to come from the easiest, almost, types of recommendations, ones that are easiest to implement. So someone saying where recommendations are at their most effective is when we can embed them in policies, procedures, guidance and training. But are these the easy wins, and are these really getting to the nub of change? And just sort of reminding you that reliance on training issues away isn't always the way to create change. But nevertheless, it is something that can be done and people can get a grip on that, but it isn't necessarily going to produce the best change, is what we found. Next slide, please. We asked whether recommendations could link in with cultural change, and there were some interesting answers about that. So there were varying responses. So some people said no impact, some more substantial impact. But when we had interviews with people, there was a kind of also a sense that cultural change was beyond the scope of serious case reviews and was much more a leadership issue. And another person said that really what makes the difference to the culture is the cuts, and the substantial cuts have created the kind of culture that we can work within. So cultural change and serious case reviews might be, I think, Donna, you're going to talk about this, whether it can have purchase or not. So if we can move the next one, please. So where should you be targeting your recommendations? So 43% said that they work best when they go to single agencies, and just over a third of people said multi-agency recommendations work really well, and similar number said recommendations for the board work really well. So those seem to be targets that work effectively. But interestingly, and this wasn't from the survey, but from the workshops, there was quite a strong feeling that when recommendations are addressed to all agencies, as in, safeguarding is everybody's work, if the recommendations are for everyone, then that can dissipate the learning that happens afterwards. And staff can kind of distance themselves by thinking, well, if it's for everybody, then someone else will do it, and it doesn't have to be for us to do it. And that's a kind of recurring theme in reviews anyway, that other people, when you've got multi-agency grouping working together, there's often a thought that someone else is more on the case about what's going on or more responsible for doing it. So I think there's quite a word of caution there about not addressing recommendations or learning to all agencies. Next one, please. So what about a type of recommendation? So there was almost a sense that it wasn't so much about the type of recommendation or where it was heading, but actually who was backing that up and what was the commitment to implementation. So one quote, "My experience is that the type of recommendations matters less than getting buy-in from the agency responsible. Having one person take responsibility for moving an action forward is critical. And similarly, the most effective recommendations are those that prompt discussion and periodic or repeated scrutiny at the safeguarding board. This works if there's a motivated senior manager who champions the cause." So it's who have you got around who's going to make a difference, who's going to push to create change, and what happens when that person leaves and is no longer there to push. Next one, please, Donna. So if we think again about the impact of recommendations, what is it that helps and what is it that gets in the way? So some thoughts about this come up next. Can we have the next one, please? So we were curious about whether there was a problem with the type of case. There were some cases actually hard to learn from. And it was interesting that 36% of our respondents said no, there weren't. 43% did say yes, but 21% didn't really know or didn't want to commit themselves either way. And for the people who thought that they weren't hard to learn from, someone said each case brings their own challenges and opportunities for learning. Others said that it was about the model review that you use. So if you've got a tricky case, a good model review should mean that learning can always be identified. And someone else said that the greater difficulty relates to impacting changes in practice. That's not about the type of review or the scenario or what's going on. It's about how to create change in practice. That's the challenge. Next one, please. So there were some examples of hard to learn from cases, and on the one hand, it was when there wasn't enough involvement. On the other hand, or too much involvement. On the other issues were about being case specific. So one comment: when there's very little agency involvement, the challenge is to establish if there should have been agency involvement and what difference that would have made. But on the other hand, someone else saying that if you've got too many people involved, the greater number of agencies, the more complicated the task. So those sorts of reviews that have, for example, featured neglect and child disability, child mental health cases, tended to have a myriad of professionals involved, and that made it much more complex. Some other thoughts about difficult cases, specific cases. So some cases had very specific features which feel less applicable to the wider workforce. So if it's a sort of a one-off incident of a particular type of feature, then that's not going to make a huge difference to the workforce as a whole. And similarly, if the review is too case specific, for example, if one practitioner failed to follow a basic procedure, then this may not apply systemically. We move on. Donna, thank you. So barriers to impact, and these are things that we've heard before, but are still there as barriers. There are preoccupation with process and the limitations of action plans. It's important to note the completion of a set of actions doesn't equate to the eradication of a particular risk. So not just the process of getting the review done and the process of the work, but actually thinking more about systemic issues, I think. And the barriers about shifting priorities. Any positive changes can be short-lived, impacted by change in priorities and new serious case reviews. So that was kind of part of the serious case review fatigue and the overwhelming number of serious case reviews, but also what happens when sort of situations change, workforce moves on, there's a new context. So positive changes can be limited by that. And the retrospective nature of serious case reviews. The process is a very expensive way of identifying learning. Its weakness is that once the process is completed, practices invariably changed anyway, so things move on. So another one, please, Donna. So what I wanted to talk to you now was what I thought was quite an interesting example of a way of creating change through a recommendation. So seeing it right through to make a difference in practice and policy. So this was an example of owning change in escalation. So if we move to the next one, please, Donna. So this came from an interview I had with a business manager from a local safeguarding board. And they had an issue about a lot of anxiety in the workforce about escalation. So there was staff diffidence about escalating concerns, especially when there'd been a children's social care decision to step down a case, or when the decision to close a case hadn't been agreed, and also unresolved differences involving police and health. So what the local safeguarding board did, they said, we changed things around a bit and said, actually, you will have situations in your professional life where you will have differences, and that's healthy, and that's good, and kind of a healthy place for agencies to be at. So instead of focusing on escalation, they focused on the professional differences. So they tried to get to the stage before escalation happened. Think about, well, what's going on where there are professional differences? How do we unpick the professional differences and make sure that the case can move forward and the family can get help or protection? So we have the next slide. So they changed the concept from escalation to professional differences, and they needed to change the language in order to do that. So they discovered that staff didn't like the word escalation. It was putting them off, and they felt it made partnership much more difficult. So instead, they changed the concept and the language to resolving professional differences. And then they relaunched this as a new way of working, had a big launch and lots of policies to back it up and lots of guidance about how it would work. And they emphasized that escalation isn't just for the lead agency, children's social care, or just for managers, but all agencies and everyone's views are important. And certainly when I've looked at serious case reviews over kind of decades, really, and one of the things that struck me most of all to start with was that someone in the multi-agency grouping knows that something isn't right often, but doesn't feel they can do anything about it. So if you can get everyone's views on board, then maybe you can create change. So staff said, no, we didn't feel that we were empowered enough to escalate, but we do feel that we're empowered enough to share a professional difference. So if we can have the next slide as well. So what happened, the board then checked and audited to see whether this recommendation and this new way of working had actually made a difference. So when they did the audits, they picked up quickly that there'd been an increase in activity. So they discovered that local agencies were keeping track of where and how the newer agents are being used and how professional differences were being resolved. So not just that they took place, but how they were being resolved, what was happening, what was working or not working, and the resulting impact on the child and their experiences. So they didn't just log the incident of professional difference. And they discovered that from the initial findings, what's jumping out is really positive. So I think that was a really nice example of how something that came out of a serious case review could be translated into changing practice, multi-agency practice and policies, and making recommendations really come to life. So Donna, if we can move on to the next one, please. Almost there. So where does impact come from? I think from the work we've done in the last review on recommendations and impact, it's pretty clear that committed managers make a big difference to making the change. Owning the change makes a difference as well. So it's the part of that sort of making the case real and local. So that means people can have buy-in. You also need to connect with practitioners and the humanity of the case. So we learned from the workshops, people were saying that the story of the case matters. We need to realize that this is about people, and when we can connect with it on a human level, then that makes it much easier to learn and change. This is going to be helped by clear, well-targeted systemic recommendations that can be followed through. But also recognize that some recommendations will take time, they're hard, and they're going to need political will. So they're not necessarily going to be something that is easily changeable or perhaps changeable at all. So just a sort of a last word about the review processes beyond serious case reviews, as Donna said. So serious case reviews and other review processes are an essential part of safeguarding children and promoting their welfare. How systems respond to incidents and reviews are an important reality check on the quality of leadership and practice locally. So I think we are going to be using reviews for a lot longer as this accountability check, and to make sure that there is the quality of leadership and practice. So I think my last slide now, I think it's the last one, if I remember rightly. Yes, so just if people want to follow up more, there is a research and practice website that's free. So they've done a fantastic job of collating all of the work that's been done on serious case reviews by the teams that I've been involved with, and the team that Donna mentioned from the 2014 study. And they've got, as well as our reports, they've got practitioner briefings, which are really handy. And bits of, there are webinars and things. So if you don't know the website already, do check it out. And if you just type research and practice serious case reviews, it comes up. And I think they're going to be updating that when there is the final review of serious case reviews. I think there is a batch of reviews waiting to be analysed. DFE are kind of having a think about when they're going to do that, and I think it's likely that research and practice will be linked into that, she says, without any justification really. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and thanks, Donna.
Thank you very much, Marian. I'm going to take this opportunity now then to open it up. We've got an input already from Kevin, who's telling us the research and practice resources are very good, that he frequently raises their profile. So an enormous number of thank yous coming through, Marian. And I'd really love you to use the chat box for questions or points that arise for you from that presentation. You know, what is really what's being highlighted for me is to recognize that this is hard. You know, the words take time, that you know, you need political will. There's a whole kind of team that's behind your aspiration when you're in a review, isn't there? You know, it's not a solo exercise. You know, you're looking at a really important and big change, and I think you know, to give it due respect is so important, having heard that. What else do you have for Marian? I'm going to fill for a moment whilst we wait for a question or a point by saying, may I apologise that I did not introduce myself or Marian at the start. So this really wasn't from my arrogance that you already know who I am. I just completely forgot. So I am Donna Odedar. I am an independent reviewer, and I use the SILP methodology. Would anybody like an introduction from that? Karen is telling us it's helpful to ask stakeholders to prioritise the recommendations. Mike? I've missed Mike's. So Nikki's happy with just a handful of systemic recommendations. She puts the single agency recommendations in her appendices, and she expects the agency to summarise the impact of their actions. Gaynor, How, as an independent chair involved for a short time, can one ensure that there is an ongoing commitment? Marian, is that one for you?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, really? So if you're only there for a short time, then you can't see follow through. So you have to negotiate with your board and boards what they're going to do, and you have to leave it to them. And I've been hearing recently with the kind of new style of reviews that some partnership boards are saying they don't want recommendations to come from the review itself. They want to create their own recommendations, and then they're responsible for following them through. So I guess if you're only there for a short time, you have to delegate that or work as well as you can with the partners that you're working with, so you can feel reassured that the process is going to create as much change as it can.
I'm going to raise a few more. So I've got Christy is telling us that she favours an approach where you've got a combination. And Christy, you've stolen the material from my toolkit about the combination approach. So it's specific and systemic. And Karen Reese is telling us she likes to build the recommendation with the partners.
Mm.
And then we have another comment, and I'm sorry I didn't note the person who sent this comment. The time that is spent fine-tuning at the end is really valuable. And does Marian agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's really important, because that's when the real work takes place, really. And so the fine-tuning is really important. So it's not just getting to the end and getting it finished, it's what you do next that really makes a difference. So that fine-tuning is essential.
And Marian's kind of along these lines as well. Tom has asked if you could speak a little bit more about the quality of, you've mentioned quality of leadership. Can you speak more to that?
I guess, yes, that's about the commitment to working together, the commitment to creating change where it happens, the openness to learning, openness to discussion. We didn't look specifically at leadership, and I'm not a leadership expert, but those were the sort of things that came through from the discussions that we had.
It might be interesting to pilot on local authorities, says Amanda, ensuring that do provide updates to reviewers for the purpose of evaluating effectiveness. Jane is saying, what about using the concept of findings, which poses questions to the safeguarding partnership?
Yes, I mean, that's used quite a lot, and the Sky model uses findings and they pose questions to the board. So that's part of their structure, really, that it does go back to the board and the board is responsible. So that's a type of review process. But interestingly, when we kind of asked people about what model of review worked well, that was really fascinating, because they said, a lot of people said, it doesn't matter what model you use, it's how good your reviewer is. So that's interesting, really. So if a reviewer who's analytical and can write succinctly and can get to the nub of the issue produces good material for the partnership to work with.
Jane, I've got a bit of view on that as well, shortly. So Pretty's highlighting the importance of a robust QA process at the end. Cass talking about the fact that she builds her recommendations with the help of partners, and she thinks it's important to link with the multi-agency action plan. Alison's echoing that she also builds them with partners. And it's thinking about the types of reviews and the ways to make impact and influence change, thinking about that during the review.
Yeah.
When I'm involved in an SCR where the methodology is more traditional, it feels more distant from practitioners.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I was hoping you'd ask me about that one. That distance from practitioners is a real problem. And what we found almost throughout all of the survey and the interviews and the workshops is most reviews do involve practitioners. So it's very unusual to have a review that doesn't involve practitioners now. So it seems to me that whatever model of review, it's possible to involve practitioners. So if you've got a traditional style review that is distant from practitioners, that is a problem, because it's involving practitioners that seems to potentially make a difference at the time during the review if you've got a kind of gathering. and after the event. And similarly, involving families is really important in children. And I think that's proving more difficult with the new review processes now. I think children and families are being squeezed from that.
Another one, Marian, for you. Karen's Reese is noting that a lot of what she's working with at the moment is actually making a policy user-friendly because they're so wordy.
And policies need to change. They need to be dynamic. They're not fixed forever. They need to be fit for purpose. So they've got to make sense. And I noticed Jane Whiffen saying there are no review processes where practitioners aren't involved, and I think that's what we found, that they were, practitioners were being included.
And then Nick has shared this point about layers. So once you layer on the next review and the next review, how can we help there? And what Nick's highlighting here for us is that if you make a link between a current and a previous serious case review, you perhaps don't need to add a new one. Yeah.
And I think that, a lot of people are thinking like that. I think that if you've got a series of issues that are coming that are very similar, and you've got a set of learning recommendations that follow that through, then you can say that we've come across this issue and this is what we're doing about it. So good luck with the national panel, for getting that through, because there's sometimes, I think, pushback from that, but I think it does make sense. And it's much better to focus on the learning rather than to waste time and money on doing another review of issues that are very similar. That seems to make a lot of sense.
Okay. Karen says, why do you think parents and children are being excluded?
Sorry, say that again.
Karen is asking, why do you think parents and children are being excluded?
I don't think are being excluded.
Yeah.
I just from information I've got from the new review processes where this is from another project. I shouldn't really be talking about it really, where people are saying that they think that they're not being as involved as they used to be. So it's slightly anecdotal, so I probably shouldn't say it really. It's not from our previous study.
Thank you, Marian. So that point about changing language and the impact of that is being picked out here by Penny, and that's helpful. And then Michelle pointing out to us that on many occasions there's a traditional model being used, and actually they're just plonking in a learning event for good measure, and that she doesn't think that always works.
Yeah, and I think it's you have to construct something that's workable and manageable, and shoehorning different approaches is going to be tricky, I think.
Siobhan's really pleased that in a recent review she developed some of the recommendations with parents.
That's really a good idea. It's we have to remember that these are children who were harmed or killed, and it's the families who are really suffering, and they have to be involved in helping to create the recommendations, whether they were instrumental in that child's harm or not. It's they have learned an awful lot and can help agencies learn how to do things differently and better.
Jane's reflecting for us as well that she feels the national panel is giving mixed messages about the style, approach and the content.
Yeah, that's another project, but yes, I think that's probably very true.
Well, thank you all. For reasons of time, I'm going to move us on. If you're happy with that, Marian, is there anything else you'd like to pick up?
No, I don't think so. No, that's really good to have those comments. It's good that people are kind of connecting with what we've been talking about. It's good.
Thank you. If there's anything I've missed, I'm happy to take this up post webinar if that helps. So type in the chat box if you'd still welcome some discussion. Okay, so over to you. Having heard from Marian, can you tell us what your number one takeaway is? So if it might not fit into any of these four, but if one of them gives us a flavour and you can use a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4, I will read them out for you now. Are you comfortable and experienced with leaving behind a smart recommendation and thinking about lots of ways to implement change? Favouring use of the process instead of large numbers? 2. 3, you're sceptical that an improvement action is going to remain a priority. And 4, you still feel experienced. Gary's happy to leave behind smartness, as is Karen, Perry, Nikki Brown, John. This is great. Sue is much more interested in using the process, as is Karen. And Chris is happy with leaving behind smartness. So I think Sadie, Helen also want to use process rather than large numbers. Pauline's a 1 and a 2. Jane's a 1 and a 2 in terms of smartness and not in favour of large numbers. This is great. We're getting far more people, I think, who are feeling unsure or inexperienced by this stage, which is really helpful to know, Marian. Thank you for that. Claire, you're saying you're a 1 which is comfortable with not always just jumping straight in with a smart recommendation, which can be so tempting, can't it? The train it away kind of approach. So thank you. The collaboration point is being picked up too. It's a big part in your success. So shall we move into some of those practicey points now that we've got so much background and kind of impetus from Marian? So what Marian has told me gives me more of a boost for what I'm trying to do, which sometimes we need, don't we? Because we could almost lazily fall back into some of our old ways. So what we should do then is pause, reset, and think about our practice points. So I'm going to offer 3 for today because otherwise it's overload. And I'm going to tell you about the toolkit that I can share with you. And it's a freebie, you know, I'm not, you know, if it's part of this webinar and you would like to share in the toolkit afterwards, it can be on its way to you by email. So this is, I've used my dream slide here. So since I've been working as an independent reviewer, it has been part of my why to have far more emphasis and place far more value on the process than the product. And we've moved such a long way from this. You know, if you work in children's reviews, you might remember the days of Ofsted when it was very much about the cosmetics of that final report. And the value in the process, I think, could sometimes be overlooked. So working on that in relation to recommendations is super helpful in my opinion. So we've got a choice. Do we stop? Do we allow the weeks and months to move by and wait for the recommendations phase? Or are we going to use our review to drive that implementation of learning early on? And this is where I want to absolutely sing from the rooftops about the value of single agency learning. When we come to a review and we've already got our agencies telling us that they have implemented a lot purely on the back of this particular case, it's really valuable within your overview report to do what my shorthand for this is, show your workings. So you are demonstrating within your review the reason why you don't need to make that recommendation. And let's face it, we didn't want to wait to the end of the review anyway to do it. We wanted it implemented immediately. And these are the kind of results that we need to remember the value of this process. So this is what parents want to hear. This is what the stakeholder, the member of the public want to know about why we are investing in reviews and why they are so valuable, even if they didn't have a recommendation at all. So there are tools in the toolkit, I will allude to them now, about if you get one piece of single agency learning brought forward, how you can, in clusters, in local clusters, cross-fertilize that too, which can give that single agency learning a boost. My second of 3 practice points is about securing buy-in. And we've talked about this and alluded to this throughout. And I think what Marian has revealed to us from her survey is that securing buy-in is one of the most important things. And I'm going to suggest that if you take away just one thing, one practice point from today, this would be the one. So the image I've shown you is about what I call push-pull. And I've talked about push-pull in my quality assurance masterclass as well, because this is what can happen at the end of the review if you haven't started early on to begin talking about improvement action. So you come right to the end of the review, you're really pulling in one direction for the recommendation and the improvement action that you want. And the people who haven't been brought in until the end are pulling in an opposite direction because they can see part of the picture you can't, and you can see a whole review which they can't. Okay? So this is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid the push-pull at the end. So, are you going to attempt this, as the image would suggest, as a solo endeavour? And I'm going to suggest you're brave if you do that. Because if you've got a really collaborative review model, it's really far, far easier to be involving the strategists and involving the change makers. You know, you walk away and somebody else has got to manage this change. So I'm inviting you to never try to do this alone. So this early involvement is what I'm going to ask you to consider. This is by Julie Andrews. Remember Do Re Mi? So Julie Andrews and Do Re Mi tell us to start at the very beginning. So if you're a reviewer, why would you start at the beginning? Because recommendations don't come at the end. Okay, this is what we could, the way we could consider it. So to take a quote from an earlier triennial analysis, and this was what came through to me from what Marian said. Challenging and changing cultures is far from straightforward, requires deep understanding of the issues, creative thinking, and engagement with practitioners and management to identify ways of moving forward. So if we start talking about changing cultures, talking about using a combination approach at the end, and testing out what our partnership that we're working with is going to be happy with, and whether they're with us, and whether we can involve the right people from the start, we are onto a winner. If I could sum it up in 5 words, this would be it. To make it count, we need to collaborate all the way through. So if we've got a lot of activity that's purely sitting within a panel, this is where it's going to be harder. So your methodology can really help you or hinder you with this one. Okay, so tools for the toolkit. I've got a PDF guide that I'm happy to share with you. I can see 3 o'clock approaching, so I will just kind of allude to it for now and share by email if you would like me to do so. And then my final point is, if you're thinking about using questions and findings, I'm going to suggest that it's important to know your partnership, because what's the point in insisting and imposing your style of learning if the partnership aren't going to receive it and they're not going to be able to own it and buy into it so well? So I think this is part of being intuitive to each other as well.